And the prophets tell the kings, don't forget the daughters of my people, but I bet you they were often forgotten. So if you're living outside the city wall, you bury some supplies, because you're not sure you're going to be allowed inside. And so you'll camouflage them, but you'll have huge jars filled with grain buried in the field.
Yeah.
Buried in the field.
Well,
Yep. Now, Jeremiah chapter 41, verse 8. The Babylonians have destroyed most of the towns, and they started torturing a farmer from out in the field. And he says, don't kill my family. I can show you where we have buried in the fields grain, oil, and honey. So these huge underground pits, you see we have another one here, are places that you could, shall we say, in case the city doesn't let you in. And sometimes by chance, an archaeologist working on excavation in a city
yes.
has not found all the underground storage pits, these pithoi, these huge, they're 5-6 feet deep sometimes. But by accident, a road project in Israel somewhere in the countryside, you come across a lone few big pots out in a field full of carbonized grain.
Mm-hmm.
But what I want to stick with you, look how desperate daily life was back then. You don't ask if the enemy is going to come. You only ask when.
It's just when.
And so the prophets are struggling to give them a message of trust in God, be wise, prepare for the enemy. But I'd like to, maybe another place we could sit down, and more at the city gate where some of these discussions are going on more intensely, and discuss what really happens during a siege.
All right, let's go to the city gate.
Okay.
And sit where the elders.
Oh, okay, big time.
Okay. I hope you are enjoying our tour of the Explorations in Antiquity Center in LaGrange, Georgia. The center is designed to show how people lived in the first century during the time of Jesus. It's open to the public and has a variety of educational programs for both adults and children. You can get detailed information about the center at its website, which can be found at diggingforit.net. If you missed our introductory program last week, you can find it on our website at lamblion.com. In that program, we saw how people lived in tents, how they cared for sheep and goats, how they quarried stone, how they grew grapes, and how they processed grapes and olives. Let's return now to our study of the importance of city gates. Okay, Jim, we're up here on top of a gate now, and what are you going to tell me about a siege?
Okay, can you imagine, they've let in all the unwalled folks are going to, the gate has been slammed closed, and now we're preparing for the Assyrians to come. We've heard their distant shofar drum and ram's horns blowing, and we know they're about to be here. The prophet's going to try to moralize the people. Trust God. Be brave. The king and the army are going to mount the highest point, the gate tower behind you here. And then they start throwing sling stones. But worse, they bring huge battering rams up the slope to our city, bam it into the wall. They even have these prying, pointed things to start wiggling some of the rocks in the city defenses. They're going to be also shooting firebrands, arrows of flaming into the city. And at the same time, sappers are going to be digging tunnels, trying to get under our wall. And some of these sieges lasted 2 to 3 years long. The Bible tells us the Assyrian siege of Samaria, the capital of the northern 10 tribes, was 3 years. Can you imagine the starvation?
Well, yes, and Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Jerusalem lasted a long time.
Yeah, the 9th to the 11th year of King Zedekiah.
And Jeremiah even describes how he saw evidence of cannibalism, of women eating their children.
Yes. This sounds strange, but we've actually found a toilet from the last couple years of Jerusalem, a toilet seat. And this will make sense in a minute, David. Don't look at me so strange.
Okay.
And Fortunately, the seat was still in situ, in its original place, but because of that, we could determine the diet and the diseases of everyone who used that toilet.
Yeah.
And the last 2 years of Jerusalem, meaning from the 9th to the 11th year of King Zedekiah, 589 to 587 BC, the diet went from field grains and fruit to grasses growing between the rocks inside the city. And the diseases were tenfold. So you can just imagine how desperate people were. Now, there were false prophets going around telling the people, don't worry, God's going to give you a final victory, don't worry, God is on your side, God loves your nation more than other nations, you won't have enemies, you won't have drought. And then the prophets of the Lord came. You know, you can be a child of God and still have drought and still have enemy. The difference is God will be with you during them. And even if, what the worst thing you could think of, captivity from your land to a foreign land, even in captivity, the Lord will weep with you by the waters of Babylon where you weep and bring you back. One of the best verses about that theology is Isaiah chapter 40, the last verse. I shall run and not be weary. I shall walk and not faint. I shall mount up with wings like an eagle. The Lord helps you through life's darkest moments and brings you back. And that hope held them through. And do you know the two easiest archaeological levels for us to separate on a dig? Before the Babylonian captivity, idols in all the houses. Most of the houses. After, not one idol. There was national repentance and renewal. They came back from that national calamity without idols. And God was able to do amazing things with the people. In the days of Nehemiah, Ezra, Esther, the rebuilding, we call the Second Temple period.
Mm-hmm. So it cleansed them of idolatry.
Sometimes it takes a hard time before you have introspection and see how much you turned away from the Lord.
Yes.
So this is a wonderful reversal of fortune. God specializes in taking difficulties, not giving up, bringing you through, and making good out of it.
Well, the Lord can do that.
Yep.
Well, folks, we're sitting on top of the city gate here at Jim Fleming's Antiquity Center in LaGrange, Georgia, and I wanted you to see something very special that's on the ground behind us. It's what was life like in the time of Jesus? 2 weeks ago, we began exploring that question with a visit to a remarkable antiquity center in LaGrange, Georgia, that was established by Jim Fleming, one of Christendom's foremost experts on biblical archaeology. This week, we're going to continue with that visit. Stay tuned for an on-site interview with Jim Fleming in which he will focus on the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples.
Lamb and Lion Ministries presents Christ in Prophecy, a program that focuses on the fundamentals of Bible prophecy, showing how current events in the news relate to biblical predictions of end-time events and the soon return of Jesus. Now, here's your host, Dr. David Reagan.
Greetings in the name of Jesus, our blessed hope, and welcome to Christ in Prophecy. Once again this week we are in LaGrange, Georgia, which is a town located about 60 miles southwest of Atlanta, down near the Alabama border. And this is the location of a phenomenal educational center that's called the Explorations in Antiquity. And it was founded and established by my good friend Jim Fleming here, who is a renowned teacher of biblical archaeology. Jim, I want to talk with you about the Last Supper. And as you well know, whenever Americans think of the Last Supper, they always think of one thing, and that's that magnificent painting by Leonardo da Vinci. But there's some problems with it, right?
There certainly are.
All right. Tell us about some of the problems.
Well, as you know, it's unique for its perspective, for the facial expressions, the hand movements, etc. It's too bad that it's daylight coming in. It was a Passover evening.
Would be at evening after sun goes down.
It's too bad it's table and chairs. The Last Supper was a reclining meal. And that they're all on one side of the table makes it easy to observe the facial expressions. But that's not how you would be seated at the time of Jesus. So one of the things we've tried to do here is, without demeaning that picture at all, help people better understand what the real setting may have been like.
Okay.
There's 4 words to go on in Luke 22, verses 11 and 12. Do you remember Jesus told Peter and John to make the preparation?
Yes.
They were to follow a man with a water pot. Mm-hmm. When they got to the doorman, they're supposed to inquire of him. Jesus said, and he will show you a large, upstairs, furnished guest chamber. How would first century people understand those 4 words?
Okay.
That's what we've tried to do here.
Okay.
Okay. Large, mega.
Mega.
If it is a small room, you have a one-sided reclining table. We have such like that, where food gets a little bench and one wall and a mat in front of it in our little village in the museum.
Okay.
If it was a medium-sized room, it would be an L-shaped reclining table. You recline on 2 sides. But if it's a mega, a large, it's a 3-sided reclining table. They use the word triclinium, even though it's based in a Latin word. Today, in modern Israel, a couch in a living room is called a triclin. Mm-hmm. And so we have here a 3-sided reclining table.
Okay.
But it's a reclining table, large, upstairs. Most downstairs rooms have to have supports to support a heavy upstairs and roof. So larger rooms tend to be upstairs. They also, in Jerusalem, which is a hill and valley city, upstairs often has a balcony that looks out over a lower roof and is lovely. Upstairs, furnished. That's actually table with mattresses. Translated furnished. It can be translated table with cushions.
Okay.
But in all the Gospels, they are reclining at table. Modern translations might say sat at table to make it modern, but the word is actually reclined, and it's a table with mattresses.
Okay, now my question is this. Where would the key figures have been at this U-shaped table?
Okay.
Jesus, Peter, Judas, John.
Okay. I just want to do my 4th word, and then I'll get there.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get ahead of you.
No, it's fine. Guest chamber.
All right.
Kataluma, guest chamber. It's a room where guests eat and sleep. Meaning, there's a table. This happens to be with 1 step down, and mattresses. If they hadn't gone to the Garden of Gethsemane, they would have slept in the room of the Last Supper. See, in your house, you have some rooms where you eat, some where you sleep. But every house that's able to afford a guest chamber, a guest room, has a place where your guests eat and sleep. And the Last Supper is clearly in a guest room where guests would eat and sleep.
So are you saying this would be both a place where you would eat and a place where you would sleep?
If you were guests. I have a hunch, Dave, that Judas brought the guards back to the room of the Last Supper. Remember, he left during the meal? Mm-hmm. Because he probably thought they were going to sleep there. Mm-hmm. But when they weren't there, he knew Jesus was enough of a person of habit that there was a favorite garden where he liked to pray. He said, don't worry, I can take you another place where probably you can get him when he's away from the crowds. But you're supposed to eat and sleep in a guest room.
I see.
We have actually found over 1,000 first-century reclining tables. So there's a lot we can go on. Yeah. But we'll get back to you gave the good question, the interesting
I want to know where they were.
Yes. There's an order of importance.
Okay.
Now, your viewers don't know in advance. And you might do the same thing Jesus' disciples did as they walked in the room, and argument arose as to who was the greatest. They knew there's an order of importance. Mm-hmm. This actually is bigwigs.
Over here, the bigwigs.
The most. Don't think of the middle like Leonardo da Vinci did.
Okay.
No. Then here, this is sort of sometimes wigs, sometimes no wigs, medium level. And over here, I'm sorry.
These are the bald-headed guys.
I was going to say the scum of the earth, but now it makes me sound like... Okay. So they go from most to least important.
So, okay. Right. So Jesus would not be sitting in the middle if he's the most important person.
Now, do you remember when Jesus, earlier in Luke's gospel said, when you're invited to a feast,
Yes.
don't take an important
Yes.
place. Someone more important than you may come, and the host will move you down. Why don't you take a low place? What an honor for you, for the host to move you up, which means everyone in Jesus' day knows about this kind of... You know, we've even found games where the board is a triclinium, and you move up and down the game board for more levels of importance.
So now, would Jesus then sit on the end?
Okay. Do you mind if you sit right here?
Okay.
I'm going to walk around you because you're not sitting, you're lying down, remember? Okay. So, I've moved in behind you, and this is the second place in.
That's it.
This would be the host. You always recline on your left elbow. You eat with your right hand, even if you're left-handed. You have to learn to eat with your right hand and recline on your left elbow. For a thief to have his right hand cut off in punishment would be a social stigma. You can't have a banquet. In the healing of the man with the withered right hand at the Capernaum synagogue would be a special joy. He can now attend a banquet.
Well, if that is where the host sits or lies down,
yes,
this must be a very special place here.
On either side of the host are the main guest seats. This side of the host would be the right-hand assistant. Any host has a right-hand assistant.
Okay.
This comes from a military motif where a general in a battlefield, 9 out of 10 of them will have their sword in their right hand and their shield in their left, and they can't defend their right side. So they'll have a right-hand man with a shield. So it's the most trusted position. That the ascension narrative has Jesus ascending to the right hand of God the Father means it's the most trusted position.
So who would have been here?
The one leaning on Jesus' chest.
John.
John. Do you remember, if I want to speak to the person behind me, I need to lean back.
That must have galled Peter.
You're not kidding.
I mean, he was numero uno,
now,
you know.
In church art, Peter's near Jesus, and Michelangelo has him near Jesus. But remember, he is not near Jesus and has to motion to John.
Oh, that's right.
To ask Jesus who the betrayer is, right?
Okay.
Now, the next important place, I'll skip over the host, is the guest of honor. It would be on the left of the host. So any host has a right-hand assistant, a guest of honor. And this is going to surprise some of our viewers. Usually, Judas is the end of the line without a halo. The way the host shows the guest of honor is to dip bread into his bowl.
That's right, yes.
And put it in the mouth of the guest of honor, offering the sop,
yes.
The dip. And remember clearly in the Gospels, Jesus offered the sop. If you ask anyone in Jesus' day, how does one show who the guest of honor is? He shares the bowl of the host. Now here's kind of a sad thought. If Jesus has John leaning on his chest, Judas, who's already arranged to exchange information for money, has Jesus heavy on his heart in every sense of the word, I don't imagine he ate much.
No.
Do you remember the text does say Jesus offered the dip to Judas before he left. I hope Judas knew the Lord loved him till the end. He offered him that reconciliation bread till the end. So these places we can guess.
Okay, so we got John here, the Lord there, Judas
Yes,
there. Where is poor Peter?
Okay, I'm going to need to get up and walk around, all right?
Okay.
There's three evidences that the first hearers would have imagined Peter at the lowest place. It doesn't sound like Peter, does it? Particularly Peter as we find him in Mark's gospel. First out of the boat, first to sink, first to confess, first to deny, first to guess when he doesn't know the right answer. Remember the Lord said, I want you to forgive one another. I always picture Peter going, how many times, Lord? 7? No, 70 times 7.
Oh.
Three evidences. People would have pictured Peter at the lowest place. Number one is the weakest evidence. We'll just call it Peter's personality. If Peter and John schlepped everything upstairs and got the room ready, it's probably all right with Peter for Jesus to give the right-hand seat to John. I mean, John helped. But for Jesus to give the guest of honor seat to the treasurer, remember Judas kept the purse? Nobody likes the treasurer. But, by the way, Judas might be the only Judean. Judas Ishkariot, Judas man of Kariot. Kariot's a village south of Hebron in Judea.
Oh.
And remember, after Judas' tragic suicide, the ascension story addressing the 11, men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up in the cloud? So the 11 may have been Galileans. Probably Judas was a Judean. For Jesus to give the guest of the host seat, the guest of honor seat to Judas, probably seemed like bad judgment to Peter. Well, if I didn't get an important seat, stomp, 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 plop, I'll make you feel bad. Now that's very human, Peter, but as we find him earlier, particularly in Mark's gospel, he seems to only open his mouth to change feet, right? He's always saying and doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. But there's two stronger evidences. Okay. When it's time to wash the feet, everybody knows that the lowest place is supposed to wash the feet. In fact, we find a basin on many archaeological digs near the lowest place.
Okay.
If he already schlepped everything upstairs and did all this work, he's not about to do it. Nobody moves. These guys aren't feeling so bad. They're not in the place that has to do it. Oh, Peter's there. Do him good. Normally, a good teacher tries three things when your students aren't catching on. Number one, you might just wait a while. Has anyone learned about being a servant? Nobody moves. Two, you might give a hint. Remember the Last Supper, we have Jesus saying, I don't want you to lord it over one another like the pagan Gentiles do. No one moves. And third, of course, you set the example yourself. But he is probably in the place that is supposed to be doing it. Earlier, do you remember when Jesus said, one of you will betray me? Everyone says modestly, is it I? In fact, that's what's great in Da Vinci's painting. He has just said, one of you will betray me. Most art until that time showed the moment of the consecration of the bread and the fruit of the vine. And everyone's face is it I? Could I do that? In John's Gospel, Peter says, it's not me, is it? The not is first. Now, Peter's sure it's not him. But remember, he was dying of curiosity to know which of these other jerks it was who was going to speak against Jesus. It says he motioned to the beloved disciple to ask Jesus who it was. Now, do you see John is looking away from everyone on his left elbow?
Yes.
It'd be hard for any of these people to catch John's attention. But you see from opposite, I think he took a little almond and tossed it over. Notice my fluent Herodian period Hebrew. Psst. Good accent? Huh?
Yeah.
Psst. No, I'm making this a little bit, yours will get serious in a moment.
Okay.
But he had to be a place he could catch the beloved disciples' eye. But when it's time to wash the feet, here's the most important point. You're always supposed to wash them this way.
Oh.
Jesus took the towel and basin and started washing the feet. Partway through, he says, you guys, who's greater? The one who washes the feet or the one whose feet are being washed? And they say, the one whose feet are being washed. And he said, yet here am I, washing your feet. And when he got to Simon Peter, you can imagine how bad he would have felt by then. Strongest evidence, Peter is the only one who refused to let Jesus wash his feet, which would make first century hearers of the text, knowing there's a place assigned to washing them, would imagine Peter was probably the only one in the place assigned to wash the feet. Remember, it actually says he cries out, Lord, I refuse to let you wash my feet. But Simon, your feet are dirty. A great conversation. I feel so bad. Give me a bath. One who's been bathed only needs their feet washed. And so this would have contributed to people picturing Peter was probably at the lowest end of the table. And it's nice, isn't it, that we can picture how first century, in light of the culture, we have 4 descriptions in first century sources about the seating around such a table. So it's something that we feel confident about.
Okay.
There's evidence that the Last Supper was indeed a Passover meal. One evidence is it's a reclining meal. The rabbis in the time of Jesus taught that every Jew, whether bond or free, had to have at least one meal a year reclining like a free person. Slaves had to eat standing. And that meal, reclining, should be Passover, because that's the feast you remember you used to be a slave, but now thanks to God you're free. So you must eat Passover reclining. The Last Supper is a reclining meal. Special attention to cups, aren't there? And when the meal had ended, Jesus took a cup again. Passover, you're supposed to have 4 cups of the fruit of the vine. It's a meal where they sing. They sang a hymn and left and went to Gethsemane. It really seems like it's a Passover meal. When the meal had ended, Jesus has a number of sayings, particularly in John's Gospel. Did you know, I'm sure you do, Dave, but it's amazing, almost half of John is Jesus' last night with the disciples.
That's right.
John 12 through 18 in Gethsemane. We have sayings about, I am the vine, you are the branches. About not to be sorrowful, he's going away from them, but is sending a comforter. I am the way, the truth, and the life. But it's very important that he washed their feet. I've washed them so you will remember that I have done it. It doesn't say do this in remembrance, so it's not quite as strong as the bread and the fruit of the vine, but that you will remember that I have done it. I'm not sure if you agree, but I wonder if that's Jesus' organizational chart for the church. You know, if I was leaving my staff, I'd make an organizational chart. Jesus washed their feet. The organizational chart of the church is we serve one another.
Yes.
And that he would want them to remember that he has washed their feet. I try to remind myself whenever I'm tempted to point out someone else's dirt. What's wrong with this picture? Hasn't the Lord washed my feet? Why am I pointing out someone else's dirt? Can't I give them a break? The Lord has given me a break. We also, of course, have that saying of doing in remembrance of me. That word in Greek is don't have amnesia.
Really?
Anamnesia. Anamnesia. This is important. Don't forget. This evening, these words of comforts that I've given you, the vine and the branch, the cups, follow me to find the way, the truth, and the life. Remember, I've washed your feet. This will help you through life. At the end of the meal, you would sing 4 songs. Psalms 115, 16, 17, and 18. They're called the Hallel. They sang a hymn and left. Did you know the rabbis taught if you celebrate Passover inside the city limits of Jerusalem, you're supposed to stay inside the city limits all night?
Oh.
They didn't go to Bethany, did they? Like they had the other nights that week. They went to Gethsemane. Gethsemane's within the city limits. And his teachings continued as they walked to Gethsemane. The shepherd's about to be taken. The sheep will be scattered. He quotes Zechariah 13:7. He was the brave shepherd. Do you remember when he was arrested? They thought he'd run off.
Yes.
So they told Judas, kiss the guy so we could quick jump on him before he leaves and we know who we're supposed to arrest. Jesus stepped forward bravely, protecting the flock. And remember, once he was assured that only he would be taken, he went willingly. And Peter and John followed. But it's a night of many failures in Peter's life. I wonder if part of what was behind Jesus saying in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I've been looking forward to eating this Passover with you. It's the only one of the 7 feasts that Jews have that's at a table. And eating a meal is the way you forgive someone. Maybe he thought it would help them later in life to remember their last meal with him was at a feast, at a table, a place, a setting of forgiveness, that might help them through the dark days ahead. So there's wonderful things to associate, of course, with that meal. And it's great to be alive. We found so many examples of reclining tables and seating practice, things like that.
Well, you know, one of the things that that excites me is that he's made a promise, and that promise is one day he will return and drink the cup with us.
With us. The marriage feast of the Lamb.
So the Lord's Supper today, which is based upon the Passover supper, is not only a remembrance of the past, but a remembrance of a promise of the future, that he's coming again.
At a table.
Amen. Well, folks, what you have just experienced is just one of many, many, many teachings that Jim Fleming can present here at the various sites of his tremendous explorations in antiquity educational center. You can bring church groups here. They can have a biblical meal and spend 2 or 3 days here being taught about first century culture, right?
Yep.
Why don't you tell people how to get in touch with you or with your center?
Oh, well, thanks.
Just look at right there.
We have a very complicated web page, Digging for It. It can be for the number or FOR.com. And we also you'll find on that our phone number and things like that too. But I think the web page would be the easiest way.
Yes, I think
There's
so.
maps how to get here. We've had many people.
What were the crucifixion and burial techniques of the first century when Jesus was crucified, buried, and resurrected from the dead? You might be surprised to find out they were quite different from popular conceptions as portrayed in movies. Stay tuned as we pay a visit to a Bible archaeology center located in LaGrange, Georgia, where we're going to talk with Jim Fleming, one of Christendom's foremost experts on biblical archaeology.
Lamb and Lion Ministries presents Christ in Prophecy, a program that focuses on the fundamentals of Bible prophecy, showing how current events in the news relate to biblical predictions of end-time events and the soon return of Jesus. Now, here's your host, Dr. David Reagan.
Greetings in the name of Jesus, our blessed hope, and welcome to Christ in Prophecy. Once again this week we are in LaGrange, Georgia, which is the site of a great educational center called Explorations in Antiquity. This is a center that was created by Jim Fleming, a renowned teacher of biblical archaeology, and the purpose of this center is to show people the culture of the first century, how people lived in the first century so they can better understand what the Bible has to say. Jim, welcome back to Christ in Prophecy.
Thank you, David.
Now, what we're going to do in this segment is have you do a teaching for us about the crucifixion. What can you tell us about the crucifixion, say techniques of the first century that's going to help us to better understand what the Bible says?
David, may I say something introduction first?
Yes.
And that is when something is really gruesome and horrific, sometimes all you can do is speak matter-of-factly, just describe it. That's what the Gospels do, and they crucified him and move on. So certainly I realize we're talking about our Lord here, but let's do some background, and we just have to be descriptive about it. Had Jesus been tried in the Jewish court system and found guilty, his death would have been by stoning. Jews were not allowed an instrument of torture or slow pain, but in that he was referred to the Roman court system and brought to Pontius Pilate, his death was by crucifixion. Pilate liked crucifying Jews. He liked making it humiliating. Normally, the governors before him allowed the criminals to still be robed. He had them crucified in the nude as a more form of humiliation. Of course, religious art, for modesty purposes, has a loincloth. The day of Jesus' crucifixion, 2 others were up for crucifixion. Did you know that the historian Josephus, born about 30 A.D., said that in 6 A.D., there were 2,000 crucifixions in one day in Jerusalem. Now, the point I want to make related to that is, he says all the trees lining all the roads to and from Jerusalem became crucifixion places. So here in our museum, we have a stepped roadway here, and along it, several trees that have been turned into crucifixion places. Do you see, this would be a way of intimidating the people as they approach the town.
Well, you've already explained something very interesting to me, because I did not know where they got the wood for all these crucifixions. Yes. I knew there were a lot of crucifixions, but there's not that much wood in Israel. So they just used trees.
They used trees. They tended to have the criminal bring the crossbar. The word cross means crossbar. So you will see at our models, it is a transportable crossbar, but the upright is a rooted tree.
So you're already destroying my images of Jesus walking through the Via Dolorosa, dragging this huge cross.
Yes.
He had the crossbar.
Yes. Okay. But he had been scourged by Pilate, and quite frankly, scourging is a form of torture.
Yes.
And therefore, there's no word in Hebrew for
And some didn't even live through that.
Yes. I was interested to see a number of years ago when the New Testament was being translated into Hebrew, what word would be used for scourge, because there's no such word. And they simply said Pilate tortured Jesus. It's a cat of 9 tails, multi-whipped with one handle. That way you could strike 40, spare 1, 39, but the guy could still have 200 marks on his back. And in any case, Pilate scourged Jesus. But having been scourged, I'm sorry for the detail, but he doesn't have use of his back muscles.
Yes.
And even though it's, quote, only the crossbar, he is stumbling because he can't really carry it. When they got to the upright that was going to be used, he would be fastened to that. But don't necessarily picture this high cross with ladders leading up. Jerusalem is a city. The trees around it are not forest trees. They're trees that are being pruned, you know, olive trees, fig trees, things like that. And so probably you can lift it without a ladder to the cross.
Plus, they wanted them down close so the people could see them for the ultimate impact.
Right.
Well, let's see what you have.
Well, okay. Generally, you would, we can stand up a minute and go look at it. Why don't we come back on this side? Part of the torture of crucifixion was that the criminal would last a long time. So there's a saddle, and the buttocks would rest on the saddle.
Is that right?
And that's so, I mean, your feet have nails in them. You could push down on your feet if you slid off, get a few more breaths as you rested on the saddle until you slid off again. But it was not merciful. It was for you to last longer. Now, they have found a case of a man who was crucified, and we'll have close-ups of that ankle bone with a spike in it. It was a tomb found in 68, building an apartment compound. What was unusual about it is the ankle bone had a spike that hit a knot in the upright, and it bent.
Is that what you have right now?
And so we have here, you can see there's a spike there, and a piece of wood.
So even though he might be sort of sitting here, he would have his legs pulled back.
In that particular case, maybe the tree wasn't tall enough to have them down. In his case, the knees came out and then back, and on either side, the ankle bone had the spike come in the side. But because it hit a knot, the loved ones couldn't pull it out. So that's how we knew
That's the first I've ever heard of this particular part. The saddle, because my impression was that they wanted him to hang, and that would cause him to suffocate.
Well, you would eventually slide off. You know, and that would make it hard to
And
breathe.
where were the spikes?
Well, it's
were they
interesting.
In the hand,
in this particular case, and we only had one so far, where we know the person died by crucifixion in Jerusalem, the spike is where you would have a wristwatch. And, you know, not where you would think in the hand, but what is interesting, the Hebrew word for hand is from the shoulder down.
Is that right?
So wounds in his hand doesn't need to mean an English hand.
So it might
It could be here. Again, I'm sorry the details, but probably it would enter the mind of the soldier, let the wrist bones hold together the ulna and radius and put the spike there.
How long did it normally take to die?
You could last for days.
Oh.
You could last for days, depending on whether you'd been scourged or not.
Yeah.
Right? Now, so we have 2 spikes there. Because a piece of acacia wood was found under the head of the nail in the crucified person, we have, you see, in this case, the soldier hammered the spike into a piece of wood, and so it would be less likely the body could pull out over it, right? Now, the criminal normally carried a sign through the streets.
A sign?
With his crime.
Okay.
Around his neck.
So I'm a robber or a thief,
yes,
or whatever?
Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. It was nailed above his head. That was probably the sign.
Mocking.
Yes, this is what's going to happen to anyone you want to be your king.
Yes.
Right? And we have the 3 languages there. But Roman signs had these little fly wings on the edge of them, so it probably looked like that. Now, what is interesting also is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke say someone put a sponge with sour wine on it on a stick.
Mm-hmm.
John uses the word hyssop stick. That's a reed that grows. Remember in the book of Exodus, the ancient Hebrews are told, dip hyssop in the blood of a paschal lamb and swab it on your doorpost and lintel. Do you see what John is doing? There's a Passover connection with the crucifixion. There's a bloody doorpost, hyssop, and redemption from death in Egypt. There's a bloody crucifixion post, hyssop, and redemption from death at the cross. So John is drawing a paschal connection with the death. Now, it doesn't need to necessarily mean a long pole. Someone doesn't want to touch a dying person. But Jesus doesn't have the strength. Remember the first time he didn't want something to drink, and later in the day he said, I thirst. He doesn't have the strength to lift his head back. But you see, you could suck from a sponge that you held up to someone. Now the sour wine is strong wine that turned to vinegar. It doesn't hasten the death, but it's considered merciful because it makes you a little bit less aware of your surroundings. And they put sour wine. Those who loved Jesus would have been grateful that some sour wine had been offered to him. John's Gospel mentions there were 4 soldiers. It's curious because Roman sources talk about 4 soldiers as well. And a Jewish male has 5 items of clothing. So we put here, if there's 4 soldiers, you see what happens. They're going to gamble for the 5th item. One soldier gets the turban, usually it's tied around the head. One soldier gets the sandals. One soldier gets the outer robe, normally open on the front. Another soldier gets the sash to tie the outer robe. What remains is the long tunic, the long t-shirt. Well, if I speak as a Roman a minute, one of the perks of crucifixion, you can sell the guy's clothes on the market. Who's going to buy a quarter of a tunic if you tear it into 4 pieces? So they throw the dice. We've put here in the cabinet some Roman dice, believe it or not, ankle bones from cattle. And they land on 4 sides rather than 6. Well, if there are 4 soldiers, you could cast lots to see who would be the lucky soldier to get the 5th item, also the tunic. So it was definitely brutal. Jesus is on the cross from 9 till 3. In Judaism, you're supposed to be buried the day you died. And that afternoon, they broke the bones to hasten the death. And the first person jumped when they stabbed him. They broke his legs. Middle person did not. He was already dead. They didn't break his legs. Third one. Again, it ends with a Passover connection. An unblemished sacrifice
also
with
a fulfillment of prophecy that his legs bones would not be broken.
Exactly.
Incredible. Well, let's take a look at a first century tomb now as where they would take the body to inter it, and tell us about the customs of that, okay?
Okay.
Great.
Good.
Let's go over here and take a look at this New Testament tomb. Wow, this is a classic rolling stone type tomb.
And look how big it is, David. You have Joseph of Arimathea was one of the elders, which means the member of the Sanhedrin, and we have some tombs in Jerusalem with this large of stone. So we have a wealthy tomb. And you see it rolls uphill to open.
That's going to take a lot of pushing.
It would. That's why the women are wondering who will help them turn back the stone. Usually they're decorated with floral or geometric designs for Jews. And outside you have a mourner's bench. And for 1 week, you would visit the tomb daily. And you would cry. Let me join you.
Cry.
You'd cry here. And they even had tear vases or tear cups, and they would collect their tears. And then they would inter their grief. Where they put the tear cup in. We find them in tombs.
I didn't know that.
It's called, burying your grief with your loved one.
And there are mentions of these tear bottles in the Bible.
Yes.
That's amazing.
So you see you're coming up a flight of stairs here.
Yes.
And notice we have an interior of the tomb, which in order to be able to have people to be able to view, we've made it so there's 3 fully preserved niches there. 2 of these niches are preserved, but the roof broke here and later collapsed. But one can see that there were 3 more niches running away. This is a typical Herodian period tomb. Notice in front of the niches is a U-shaped bench on 3 sides. That's where you would dress the body. And then afterwards slide it to a niche. So we have one sort of an example to see there. These kind of tombs are only found in Jerusalem from 37 BC to 70 AD. A very restricted period. So Herodian period tombs. Well, can you imagine then that Friday the body would have been brought up but not yet slid in a niche, that gives an example later, but simply laid on the bench. Because they have to be adding grave cloths and spices. Usually you would be bringing grave cloths. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea had a mixture of myrrh and aloes and some grave cloths. They would have wrapped the body with the spices, but Sabbath was coming. And remember it says, as they exited the tomb, Sabbath was being manifest. That means people were lighting their oil lamps just before the sunset. Would not be the tradition of the women to come back on Saturday. So first light Sunday morning. The women wanted to add more grave cloths because they didn't have enough time before sunset Friday night. And so they've come back to the tomb, wondering who would help them roll back the massive stone that we saw. And of course it was rolled back. And we have the mystery of the resurrection narrative. Let me just mention a little bit more about burial practices. You would wrap a body from foot to head, but notice you have to tie off the shoulders and come in again and start with the head.
So a separate wrapping for the head.
The head. And that's mentioned in the gospel narrative. If someone had just stolen the body and unwrapped the grave cloths, you'd expect to see a jumbled pile of grave cloths. But remember, when they saw the head wrapping separate from the body wrapping, there's a little space between them because you're tying off the shoulders and starting again with the head. That's significant when the women tell the disciples, and Peter and John run to the tomb. Remember, John got there first. I guess he could jog faster. And he stooped and looked in. You saw how it was only 5 hands high for the door, 7 hands high for the door. But Peter, when he got there, walked right in. He's the first one to witness. And that strange thing, when he saw the head wrappings still separate from the body wrappings, he believed. If someone had stolen the body and left the grave cloths, there would be just a pile of grave cloths. And people back then would have understood, you tie off the body and then start again, coming in from the shoulders for the head. And it was seeing the head cloth separate from the body cloth made him realize he could not explain the arrangement of the grave cloths. The body was missing, but the grave cloths were undisturbed. Normally what would happen is that you would add more spices. The rest of that week gets smellier, right? Remember in the Lazarus story in John's Gospel, Martha says, by now Lazarus stinks.
Yes.
You would add more spices. And you'd have that week of coming back for the funeral wake. You'd add time for crying out on the bench out in front. But the interior has this arrangement of a U-shaped work area. The angel story is there was, for the resurrection narrative, there was an angel sitting at the head and at the feet. It means the body had not yet been slid into the niche. Now, a niche, again, is made to have it so the body would slide in head first. And then, in Jerusalem climate, it would take about 2 years for a body to decompose. And the plan would be, at the end of those 2 years, to come back and collect the bones and put them in a bone box.
An ossuary.
Good man. The proof of the resurrection of Jesus, however, is not just the arrangement of the grave cloths, which could not be explained, but rather Jesus' followers turned that first century upside down. They should have returned to their nets had the resurrection not occurred, but instead they turned the first century upside down. And it was their belief in the resurrection that kept them serving God and kept them, even in spite of danger and persecution, willing to give their lives in obedience to God's will, sharing the gospel throughout the Roman world.
I hope you are enjoying this teaching about the crucifixion and burial of Jesus. Our teacher is Jim Fleming, one of Christendom's foremost experts on biblical archaeology, and he has been speaking from his Antiquities Center that is located in LaGrange, Georgia, about 60 miles southwest of Atlanta. You can find detailed information about the center on their website at diggingforit.net. I want to emphasize that they have educational programs for both adults and children, and they can tailor their programs to your time schedule. This is the fourth in a series of programs that we videotaped at the center. If you have missed the previous programs, you can find them on our website at lamblion.com. As we bring this series to a close, I'd like to show you some footage we have not shared on our other programs. It will illustrate to you what a wonderful learning center Jim Fleming has created, and I hope it will motivate you to plan a trip to the center with your family or with a church group. Here now is an illustration of what I'm talking about. Okay, Jim, now it looks like we're in a threshing floor area here. Is that what this is?
4 months of the year, a farmer growing barley and wheat, their life is related to this agricultural installation. In March, April is the barley harvest. And you would bring in the handfuls, the sheaves of grain, put it in. It's always a place where bedrock is exposed. Then you have a threshing sled with sharp rocks in it. That is turned with the rocks facing down. And a trained mule or donkey, or you standing on it, guiding them, makes circles.
Oh.
And the sharp rocks scraping the bottom cuts the pieces of the stalk into smaller.
So that's why you have to have bedrock instead of a soft ground.
Yes.
And so the animal pulls this around, and it grinds the.
And it cuts it.
Yeah.
Then
what are these used
These
for?
are winnowing forks. You see.
How do you do that?
And then you would now we don't have these cut very small, but you wait till a windy afternoon.
Yeah.
And you throw it up in the air, and the lighter elements are blown aside, and the grain fall. But usually there's still some pieces in it.
So what is this here?
So then you have to sieve it a little bit more, and usually you just pieces of cloth or whatever, sieve it, and then you bag it. And this is your harvest. The reason this is important is here where you know what your economy is going to be like. Did you get 4 bags for every bag you sowed, or 40 bags? And so it's interesting, in the Canaanite Bible, which was found at a place called Rosh Shamra, you always build an altar to Baal at a threshing floor. Remember, Baal's the rain god, the god of the economy, GNP god, because that's where you're thanking Baal for the harvest. When David conquers Jerusalem, he purchases the threshing floor of Araunah and builds an altar to the Lord, a different god, is going to be thanked at Jerusalem's threshing floor. So it's not only an agricultural installation, it's a religious installation.
I wonder why David went up and bought a threshing floor.
It's not because it's a vacant lot. Probably because Baal was being worshipped there.
Yeah.
And he's changing the religious status of Jerusalem's
And that was on Mount Moriah
eventually where Solomon built the temple.
Yeah.
For the temple that Jesus saw, here his temple was.
Okay. Well, let's visit another site.
Okay.
Now, Jim, what is this? This looks like a market area or something.
Yes. Yep, Market Street. This is a vending area. You see, of course, we have a place here where you could weigh out buying some nuts here.
Okay.
Let's just say you wanted 3 ounces.
All right.
I put my 3-ounce weights
All
there.
right.
I've been adding over here, until they are level. And this would be just, right?
That's just, yes.
There's a phrase, Kisat Chesed Bivakasha. A little grace, please.
Oh, so
and if
give me one more.
And if the vendor wants you to come back, they put another hand on your side. Now listen, that's the same word for after the golden calf. I am a God full of chesed.
Oh. The Bible reveals that there were at least 2 secret believers in Jesus who served on the Sanhedrin, which was the highest governing body of the Jewish people. Those 2 men were Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. Have you ever thought how they might have become believers? Have you ever considered how dangerous it must have been for them to show any sympathy toward Jesus? And have you ever thought about what might have persuaded them to believe that Jesus was the promised Messiah? Stay tuned for a fascinating interview with the authors of a remarkable new book that deals with these 2 Jewish leaders and the questions I have just raised about them.
Lamb and Lion Ministries presents Christ in Prophecy, a program that focuses on the fundamentals of Bible prophecy, showing how current events in the news relate to biblical predictions of end-time events and the soon return of Jesus. Now, here's your host, Dr. David Reagan.
Greetings in the name of Jesus, our blessed hope, and welcome to Christ in Prophecy. I have in the studio with me today 2 men who are authors of an outstanding new novel about the last days of Jesus leading up to his crucifixion, and the roles of 2 Jewish leaders who were secret believers in Jesus as the Messiah promised by God. Sitting next to me here is my dear friend Bill Perkins. Bill is the founder of a ministry called Compass International, which is located in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. It is the ministry that sponsors the great Stealing the Mind conferences that focus on defending the fundamentals of the Christian faith. Welcome to Christ in Prophecy, Bill. We're glad to have you.
Thanks so much for being here.
Okay. And sitting next to Bill is another person that is very important to this book. He is the co-author, Buck Storm. Buck is also from Coeur d'Alene area. He's a very gifted poet, songwriter, musician, novelist. Welcome to Christ in Prophecy, Buck. We're glad to have you.
Thank you, David. Really nice to be here.
I tell you guys have traveled a long, long way to get here. It's like a 4-hour airplane ride. But we really appreciate you coming and sharing about this tremendous new book. And let's just start off by saying, where did this book come from and how did you all end up collaborating?
God has sort of given me an idea for a story. And I've been looking at it and reading about it, making notes about it for 3 or 4 years and just rattling around. And you know how those things, you keep forgetting about it and then God brings it back to your mind. Yeah. And our purpose of our ministry is to teach the Bible's accurate and to teach the importance of Bible prophecy. So the more I thought about this idea of these 2 characters and these 2 guys, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, and what it would have been like for them to see Jesus bursting on the scene with all these miracles and how to deal with him, I thought this should be a story for him. This should be good. And by the grace of God, my friend Buck is a budding novelist. I didn't quite know how much he was budding at the time. But
I would say it's already flowered.
Yeah, so I said, Buck, we look at this. This is something we could do. And he looked at it and he prayed about it and he said, yes, let's do it.
You know what this reminds me of is our former really great friend Tim LaHaye, who's gone on to be with the Lord, who had written many, many books. But when it came to the concept of writing the Left Behind series, he knew he was not a novelist. I mean, you can write good books about Bible prophecy, but it's another thing to be a novelist.
That's right.
And he had enough good sense to go to a novelist and say, here's my idea, let's work it out. So you had the idea, and you went to Buck to work it out in terms of a novel format.
Writing a novel, to me, I think it's a gift. You have to organize your thoughts in a certain way. And you and I write books, but we wouldn't necessarily be good novelists. And he has that gift, and people that read the book, he sucks you in immediately, and you can't put it down. Well,
tell us about your background, Buck.
Well, I've been a musician and a songwriter for a lot of years. But as far as writing novels, writing goes, I grew up reading constantly. I mean, my childhood was spent with, kind of under the covers with a flashlight reading Louis L'Amour novels and Salinger and Hemingway. And so I've always wanted to write novels. So several years ago, I just started. I thought it's like writing a long song, right? And I quickly found out that there's a lot more craft to it than that. Yeah. How hard could it be?
Well, I tell you what, when I was reading this, and I read a pre-publication edition of it that was sent to me on a PDF format, I could see all through the book that you were a songwriter and that you were a poet because of the way you express things. It's just beautiful writing, absolutely beautiful writing all the way through.
You
picked a wonderful writer. God really blessed you.
I think God picked him, but yeah.
The title of the book is The List, and the subtitle here says, An Ancient Riddle, Will the Answer Be a Blessing or a Curse? What in the world does the title of the book refer to?
Well, the idea is that these two guys are watching Jesus come onto the scene, and they don't know what to think or do. And they're rich guys. They're in the Sanhedrin. They're powerful men. And what one of them does is he has all these Torah scrolls, and he starts searching through his scrolls.
That's Nicodemus, right?
Nicodemus. And he's finding these prophecies that Jesus is actually fulfilling, and it interests him, and he can't shake that fact. And in fact,
so he starts making a list of prophecies.
He does. And remember, early in John, Nicodemus goes to Jesus by night, and that scene is in the book. And so he's trying to figure this out, and he keeps finding more prophecies, and the list gets longer and longer. And he has a friend that's an odd friendship because Nicodemus is a Pharisee, and Joseph of Arimathea is a Sadducee. He's a rich guy. And
those two guys are not even supposed to speak to each other.
It's a lot of, it's right. And so they have this odd relationship. And Buck takes all of this from there, and I'll let you elaborate on it from this point. But.
Well, yeah. So I like to think of it. I love the tension between having a Pharisee and I think it's like
tension, all right.
It's like if Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton came together and found unity in Christ, somehow. But and it's interesting in the biblical account, you have these two men at the end are the ones that are burying the body. That they're coming together to bury the body. So somewhere between Nicodemus's visit to Jesus at night, which happens very early in the gospel accounts, and the two men burying the body, there's a tremendous story that has to happen in there. And that's what really attracted me to this idea of writing this book. What a great journey to step back and to take that walk through those 3 years.
One of the things that fascinated me about the book, Buck, is that not only do you develop the stories of these two men who should have been antagonists and who are kind of leery of each other, but they develop this friendship and this common interest. But you also develop a story about their wives and their relationship, and it's a wonderful story.
Yeah. I think it was Bill and I would meet just about once a week or maybe every other week and have lunch and just kind of bat ideas around as I was writing the book. And he made a comment one time about Jesus really being a radical in the sense that his followers weren't all just men, which would have been the culture at the time, but he had women following him
who were also helping finance his ministry.
They were helping finance, and I thought that's a fascinating aspect to the ministry of Christ that really set him apart from a lot of the teachers.